Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to dig into a perspective on the Russia-Ukraine conflict that you probably haven't heard much about in the mainstream. We're going to unpack the arguments from our source material and really try to understand a completely different way of looking at this war.
So, what's the game plan here? How does this argument actually get built? Well, first, we'll hit that core question, who's right and who's wrong. Then, we'll zoom in on NATO's role, see what's going on there. After that, we'll pivot to India's unique position. Then, take a look inside the Kremlin strategy, and finally, we'll wrap up by exploring this idea of hypocrisy among global powers.
All right, let's get right into it. We're going to start with the most fundamental, and let's be honest, the most complicated question of the entire conflict.
You know, this is the question, right? It's the one that frames how pretty much the entire world sees this war. And our source material, well, it has a very, very direct answer.
Yep, that's it. Just one word. According to this viewpoint, Russia is in the right. Now, that is a huge claim, and it demands a serious explanation. So let's start unpacking exactly how this argument gets built.
So how on earth do you get to that conclusion? Well, to even begin to understand this, we have to shift our focus away from Russia for a moment and turn our attention toward what the source describes as NATO's provocations.
This quote right here, it really gets to the absolute heart of the argument. The idea is that Russia's invasion wasn't some random act of aggression out of the blue. Instead, from this perspective, it was a reaction, a defensive move against what it saw as an existential threat being placed right on its border.
Okay, so what is that specific threat? The source points its finger squarely at NATO's Article 5. The thinking is, if Ukraine were to join NATO, the entire military machine of that alliance would suddenly have a direct line right up to Russia's border. And from this viewpoint, that was a line that just could not be crossed.
And this really shows you just how differently the two sides see this. I mean, it's a fundamental disagreement on what NATO even is. Officially, it's a defensive alliance. But the interpretation from our source is that it's actually a tool for aggressive expansion, an offensive force that's been pushing eastward for decades.
Which brings us to the core challenge that this perspective poses to NATO's very existence today. The source basically asks, look, the Soviet Union is gone, it's been gone for a long time, so what is the purpose of this massive military bloc? Why does it still exist? And more importantly, why does it keep getting bigger?
Okay, so that's the big picture on the global stage. But how does all of this connect to a major player like India? Let's take a look at the very specific and very deliberate position it's taken in this conflict.
Yeah, according to our source material, there's really no beating around the bush here. India's support for Russia wasn't some hidden, behind-the-scenes thing. It was an open and frankly unapologetic foreign policy choice. So why? Why take that position? Well, the reasons given are all about pure pragmatism. It's not about feelings or ideology, it's about the fact that Russia has been a critical ally for India, especially using its veto power at the UN. From this viewpoint, it's about loyalty, historical ties, and showing strength by standing by your allies.
And here's where the source makes a really direct comparison. It basically says, look, if the United States can openly and proudly support its allies like Israel and Ukraine, then why should India be shamed of supporting its long-standing allies like Russia? It's framed as India just acting like any other major world power.
So we've talked about the outside forces, but our source says there's a whole other piece to this puzzle, an internal one. To really get the full picture, we've got to look inside the Kremlin.
And this is where things get really interesting. The argument here is that the war in Ukraine isn't just about geopolitics and NATO. It's also a calculated move by Vladimir Putin to deal with his own problems back at home. The source lays out a pretty clear chain of events. First, Putin changes the constitution to make sure he can stay in power until 2036. But then, as he starts facing more and more pushback at home, he turns to a classic political playbook. Start a war outside your borders to get everyone inside your borders to rally around the flag. And you.
And a long, drawn-out war? Well, that serves a very specific purpose. It creates an atmosphere where any kind of dissent can be labeled as treason. It allows him, as the source argues, to identify and then neutralize his opponents, like the leader of the Wagner Group, all under the cover of a national crisis. All right, this leads us to the final part of this whole argument, and it's where we zoom way out to look at the entire international system, and specifically the role the West plays in it.
And the argument here gets incredibly pointed. The source straight up accuses Western nations of moral hypocrisy. The claim is that they lecture the world about human rights and national sovereignty, but completely ignore their own long history of military interventions.
So where's the proof for a claim like that? Well, the source points to a whole list of countries, a pattern of intervention where Western powers got involved militarily, often with devastating results that ironically undermined the very principles they claim to stand for.
And this quote, wow, it connects that modern critique to a really deep historical wound. It suggests that for a lot of people in countries like India, when former colonial powers start lecturing about morality, it just doesn't land. There's a fundamental lack of trust baked in from history.
And look, this isn't just some abstract political debate. The source puts a real number on the human cost for India. We're talking 200,000 to 300,000 Indian workers whose lives were completely turned upside down in places like Libya and Syria after these interventions. That makes the consequences feel very real.
So that leaves us with a pretty stark question, doesn't it? If this is all just one big, cynical game of power, with countries as chess pieces, what's really at stake for all of us? What's the end game?
And our source leaves us with this famous and honestly pretty chilling warning. The suggestion is that the path we're on, this path of constant escalation and power politics, risks a catastrophe so total that it could literally send human civilization back to the Stone Age. A very powerful thought to end on.